session. I'll make my introduction very brief because I want to hear what you have to say as much as you do. Mike is one of the best known ecologists in this country, if not the world, and has done a lot of seminal work in evolution and ecology has been done by him. To recite some of the papers that many of you probably know, or you may not know because some of these were done so long ago that they've become part of the ecology canon. But regardless, I'm delighted to have him because he's been tilting at the reconciliation ecology windmill for some time, basically coined the term. And this is an area, something that's very important to us here locally. It's a term, a concept that we are trying to make more popular and trying to use as the basis for a lot of things going on in this area for trying to bring back habitat for native species. So, Mike, I'll just turn it over to you.
Thank you, Peter. It's actually a delight for me to be here. This is clearly one of the groundbreaking leading institutions for ecology in the world, and it has been for decades, and it's always a pleasure to see not only all the old fogies like me, but to see you guys. I see a lot of young people here, and I hope you get interested. Peter mentioned, basically coined the term. Let me tell you a story. When I realized what was going on, I actually brought a pile of dictionaries to my desk. It was about this high. And I spent 2 days trying to find something that would capture the complexity and the ambiguity of reconciliation ecology. So if you want to know what it means and you think it's my problem that you don't know what it means, you're right. I want to set the stage by looking at this as a very, very long-term problem. One that I clearly won't be around, God willing, to see either come to a very serious resolution or even a very pleasant resolution. We're here today as beginners in a process which could take 1,000 years, or 100 years, or 200 years. Whatever the number is, I don't intend to live that long. Okay. We are therefore looking through what I call the ecologist's telescope. Now, an astronomer uses a telescope to see things that are far away, and therefore way in the distant past. The ecologist uses a telescope to see things that are way in the distant future. And that's where we are today. I want to study with you, especially some of the latest results. There'll be a bunch of slides that I'm going to show you that have never been seen before by anybody, and represent the results of the last year's research. But I want to show you what the world of the future looks like under certain circumstances. Now, I'm doing this as a scientist. And as a scientist, I have no more votes than anybody else. I have to be very careful to keep my boosterism for diversity under control. The people that I talk to have to be well aware when I'm wearing my scientist's white coat, which is never, but figuratively speaking, and when I'm wearing my birder's hat. Those are very different kinds of lectures and discussions that I've got to have, and I recommend that you all do that too. It's crucial that the people who make policy in this country and the people who elect the people or appoint the people who make policy, the citizens, rely on us completely for unbiased, neutral information when we speak with our white coats on. They have to know it. I'll tell you a story about a friend of mine who's an excellent ecologist who was appointed to a UN committee with economists to try to educate those people about some of the things that were going on in ecosystem dynamics. He tried during one meeting and he discovered that they were mathematically illiterate. There was just too much to handle. So he went back to his office and he concocted a model that was a linear model that he knew was wrong, but he could explain it. And it had the same conclusions as the complex model. I don't think that's a good strategy for us. I think we have to tell the truth. And the truth in many cases is we don't know what's going to happen. But I'll show you some things that I think are true today, and they are based upon what has been called ecology's fundamental law, or one of ecology's fundamental law. It was discovered by no less than Alexander von Humboldt in 1805, and it's simply that size matters. The more area, the more species. I've got 1,000 slides that show you examples of that, but I'm not going to use them today. Tomorrow. Size matters. Why should this be true? And what are the scales that we're looking at? Well, we know what the scale is that we're looking at today. We're looking at the so-called sustainable scale, the self-sustainable scale of diversity, which is the scale at which we can say this area generates the species, and when it suffers an extinction, that extinction is global. Self-contained means self-sustainable. Now that's a mathematical definition actually, and there are no such regions of the earth, but we're going to pretend from mathematical perspective that there are, and we're going to do some analyses pretending that there are these self-sustainable regions in which the endemicity is 100%. Every single species was born there, and when it becomes extinct, it'll be gone from the surface of the earth forever. That leaves out a lot of scales of the species-area relationship, and we'll talk about them tomorrow, but not much. Because, in fact, none of them lead to either reconciliation ecology or the need for reconciliation ecology in order to preserve diversity. This is the scale. This is the scale that matters. So when we talk about island biogeography, for example, those of you who know about island biogeography, in all of island biogeography theory, there is a big daddy. There's a donor. There's a place from which the island gets its species, and when the island loses its species, it's a local loss. It can always, in time, replace that extinct species by getting it back from the donor all over again. Get these do-overs in island biogeography that do not exist at the scale of the entire self-contained region that we want to look at today. And I'm going to call them regions. I'm calling them regions because Slater, who invented the concept in 1858, called them zoological regions. I'm going to call them zoological regions because that's the ethical thing to do. He got the naming rights. Plant people do not call them regions. They call them kingdoms and realms, rather, and that's okay for them. But us animal people, we've got to stick with Slater. So I'm going to do that. Now, we need to have some kind of a dynamic model that describes this give and take, this dynamic balance that presents us with a self-sustaining region. And that turns out to be possible, provided we look at the area and we stick to our system analysis guns. In system analysis, if you want something to be a dynamic steady state, and you want that steady state to be stable, you got to find a feedback variable. A feedback variable is something that's going to affect the rate of increase or decrease of the variable that you care about, which in this case is the number of species. Very simple. And the feedback variable that I can see, and I proposed this 40 years ago, the only feedback variable that I can find is the area that a species occupies, its range. as those areas get reduced in size, the chances for vicariance are reduced, the rate of speciation is reduced. The more species, the less area each one will have, and that's the hypothesis here that drives the theory. That's the assumption that drives the theory. The more species, the less area per species, the lower the rate of speciation per species. And I do apologize for that ugly green color. I'm afraid I've used it a couple of times here. But that says speciation per species, and you can see that's, as the number of species increases, that's declining. Extinction per species goes just like island biogeography. The smaller the greater the number of parts, you divide up the resources of a place, the smaller the populations, and the smaller the populations, the higher the extinction rate per species. This generates an internal steady state. And that steady state is stable, you can analyze it trivially, and it's going to last according to this particular model. Fine. But what if we change the area? How does that affect things? And the answer is, if we change the area, we can make the prediction that von Humboldt's rule follows whole zoological regions at the scale of the entire globe. Why? Well, if we have a smaller area relative to a larger one, and they're in red here, and in blue is the larger area, we can expect that for any given number of species, the average range size will be higher where there's more land. And so this curve of the speciation rate per species will be elevated, and the extinction curve will be depressed because, again, there are greater populations for any fixed number of species. Now, it's very, very important that you understand that you can't go out into the tropics or any other place, measure the extinction rate at any given instant, and make any conclusions whatsoever. This is a theory about rate curves, not points, but curves. And as long as you understand that, it's easy to do. Sometimes hard to get the data, but it's intellectually very, very easy to do. So in general, the larger the area, the greater the number of species at the steady state, and we can expect a progression like that. And in fact, we see progressions like that. We see them in the literature now, even in the fossil record, with trees in the northern hemisphere going back a couple of 100 million years. Ocean goes up, land shrinks in effect. Ocean level goes down, land expands in effect. And keeping time to the music is the diversity, the species diversity of the fossil trees. It's remarkable. It's a thing which is, however, repeated many, many times. Not enough. I'd like some more. And we're going to look at some today that have sort of not been seen before, some partly seen. Okay. This particular idea needs a database for us to test it. And we selected the database, the fabulous database of the World Wildlife Fund, because it's big and it's fabulous and it covers the whole world, and it's got over 800 of these ecoregions, which are a lot better to use than the names of countries like Georgia, for example, or Russia, for another example. Those are very, very different biological places, different sizes. But if you're in the World Wildlife Fund and you're starting to look at ecoregions, you're trying to make biological sense of geography. And that's what this does. These ecoregions have some variety in them. They have some habitat variability, but it's about the same for each ecoregion. It's a judgment. Maybe it's a mistake in part, but it's a whole lot better than looking at the political lines that are drawn on a map. A whole lot better. Anyhow, they have looked at every single species of bird, mammal, reptile, and amphibian on the terrestrial surface of the globe. And they give people access, like me, to that, and they give them access to the other records that go along, which is the area of the ecoregion. and 102 climatic variables as well that we're going to be able to use. So we've got our database, and we filtered it out in a couple of ways. First, sometimes a species will live in two different zoological regions because they haven't read math books. So if I want to tell you how many species there were, I can't simply add up the number of species in the World Wildlife Lists. When we do our filtering, we find out we were working with 24,992 vertebrate species. And that's not all of them. That's not all that seemed to be there. But that's all that we really need. In addition to that, there were 4,416 unique genera in the data set that we used. And those, that's plenty, but those do not include certain things which are bad ways to test this theory about the relationship between area and global diversity. For example, islands. Most of the islands get thrown out. Why? Because they're islands. They are not self-contained areas, but they're islands, and sometimes they produce new species. So when we saw an island that, or an archipelago that was generating some new species, we kicked it out. We didn't know what the signal was. Should we treat it as its own zoological region, or is it part zoological region and part island? With so many different species and so many different places, 755 ecoregions to be exact, we just kicked it out. Bad data, not good for the test. So those are our data, and we have to funnel them through another filter. We have to know to which ecoregion these things belong. Well, the World Wildlife Fund gives you a suggestion, but the suggestion is only approximately good. There's some problems with it. And what we did was to filter it out by looking at the endemicities. So we'd give it a try at these, say, 12 ecoregions on the face of the Earth, terrestrial, and that didn't work. We'd try a different number. We'd try the borders differently. We'd make an ecoregion, for example, in extreme southern South America that was supposed to handle the temperate zone of southern South America. Turns out, by the way, that one has 0 endemics. So that clearly isn't its own ecoregion. There's nothing there in the way of land vertebrates that's endemic. It's got some plants that are endemic. So we have a back and forth between the data set and the need to pump up the endemicity to convince us that we're actually looking as much as possible at separate, self-contained, self-sustaining zoological regions. And this is what we wound up with. 9. You can find suggestions for almost all of those back in the discussions that follow Slature's original declaration of the principle of zoogeographical regions, but not absolutely every one. There's a little difference. And we had a problem drawing the border in Mexico between the Nearctic and the tropics. And notice one of them here, which is the smallest, that's Hawaii. That's its own ecoregion. It has very, very large endemicities, as pretty much everybody knows. They don't actually show up very well in the data. New Zealand is another ecoregion that's by itself. There are 9 ecoregions here. We tried to cut the arid part of the Palearctic out for its own ecoregion. Endemicity was pitiful. It was less than 20%, etc. We also tried looking at the whole Arctic. No good. Nowhere near enough endemicity. In the end, the endemicities look like that. And the endemicities, this is the species level now. You can see them, and I'm not going to read you all these numbers, but you can see now that if you look at the entire set of vertebrates, Madagascar is 83% endemic species, and the low one is the Palearctic, which is 37% endemic species. And the reason for some of these low values is birds which were treated by the World Wildlife Foundation in a way that didn't exactly make it a pleasing analysis to do birds, because birds migrate. And it's very difficult to decide where they belong or where they've actually originated. But that's what we got, and that's what we did. And we decided then that we were going to analyze these things and see whether there was a relationship between the area and the area of the zoogeographical region and the number of species that it held. But we also have another problem, which is not a problem, but clear in the data, and that is climate matters too. You can't ignore the fact that the signal of climate is in the results of diversity at these levels. That's not the way people think about it, I think, but if you go up into the northern regions, which are huge, they don't have very many species because it's cold and it's not very productive, or something else. But hold on to those two. It's cold and it's not very productive, because we've looked at both of them. Well, here are the results for the first pass, which calculates the variables from the World Wildlife Fund. It looks formidable, but it's not. We just sum the areas of all the ecoregions in a particular zoogeographical region and call that the area of the region. Easy. Mean temperature, we take a weighted average of the temperature of each of the regions. Multiply the temperature of a region by its area, divide by the total area so we have a proportional effect, and sum the result, and that gives us one number for the entire zoogeographical region. So all the Palearctic gets one temperature. That's ridiculous, isn't it? So I thought it was ridiculous, but I didn't know what else to do. And we do the same thing for the actual evapotranspiration, which people have found, this comes from ages ago from my own PhD thesis, that it's a good surrogate for productivity. We did not have good data for Hawaii and real productivity, but it turned out, and I won't show you this, it's in a paper, it turned out that actual evapotranspiration has not forgotten its role to provide us a good surrogate for productivity, and so we use that. And again, we're using the weighted average. So we take the actual evapotranspiration of a particular ecoregion, multiply by the area of the ecoregion, divide by the whole, get the weighted fraction, and there we go. One actual evapotranspiration for each of the 9 zoogeographical regions. Also ridiculous, but it's there. Well, it turns out it works. It works. We got an R squared of 97% with that set of variables. Let me show you what the graph looks like. When I saw that graph, I could not believe it. I almost still can't believe it. The largest error is Australasia, Australia, New Guinea, actually. It's about a half order of magnitude when you plot it this way. So Australia has about twice as many species of vertebrates as it ought to. And if you think about the biology of Australia and what we've learned there, you'd say, if Australia isn't odd, there's something wrong with this study, because everybody knows Australia has too many vertebrates. So our error, in a sense, becomes a confirmation of the work of the World Wildlife Foundation in putting all these things together. And there's the R squared. It's 0.974. The P associated with area is pretty high. It's 5 times 10 to the minus 6. And it's not quite so remarkable for actual evapotranspiration. It's only about 1 times 10 to the minus 3. These are very significant numbers, even with only 9 points. And even with these crazy things about one number for temperature, one number for actual evapotranspiration. This is crazy. Absolutely crazy, but it works. Not only does it work, okay, but it works at the level of the different classes. So you can separate this out into birds, mammals, etc., and it works for all 4 classes. Pretty much the same way. There's a reduction in significance a little bit, but not much. And considering the fact that there are far fewer species that have been analyzed here, you'd expect a reduction of significance. Well, that's actual evapotranspiration. What about the temperature? Maybe that doesn't do as well. What is this climate variable? So we've got the area thing going. That was right. What about the climate thing? Well, actual evapotranspiration is the stand-in for productivity. What is temperature the stand-in for? How does that work to promote speciation rates or reduce extinction rates? That's a puzzle that has daunted me for a long time. And I've tried a number of times to come up with an answer, and so have many of my colleagues, and I haven't seen one yet that holds water. Thus, I think this is the biggest puzzle in all of diversity science. How does climate do its work? How does it influence speciation rate curves and extinction rate curves to bring about this kind of magnificent correlation? Again, R squared, 97.3%, with very, very, very low probabilities associated with both area and temperature, mean annual temperature. Well, one of the things this does immediately is to make us upset because we are losing area to nature, and we can now predict, here's our telescope, what this is going to cost the world of vertebrates in the long run. The answer is a lot. You can put your favorite scenario on here, and I've used Greek letters to make it seem like I really know something, but I don't. This one assumes that we somehow managed to take only 60% of the area of the terrestrial surface of the Earth away from nature. The result, if we take a certain proportion of the energy using the actual evapotranspiration to calculate it, we leave 60% of the AE, so we have 60% and 60% remaining. The result is an extinction that has been called a mass extinction by every paleobiologist that has ever looked at the rates of mass extinction. We have, at this point, left only about 35% of the vertebrate species of the Earth, and that's a rosy future. If, in fact, you think, well, we're really at 5 or 10% of the area, then you're looking at extinctions of 90% and 96% of the vertebrate species. It's an unprecedented mass extinction that we are causing, according to this result. Now, if you're lucky and you want to look at this in terms of, well, it's not the energy flow that's doing the job, it's really the temperature. We don't know how yet, but it's really the temperature. Why, then you read the graph right off the top. And indeed, that ameliorates things just a little bit. So if you've got 20% of the area left, then you're going to find that you have approximately 70% extinction instead of 80% or 85% extinction. So climate is a player, but it's not as important, and it was very difficult to pick up the signal of climate as well, I must add. What are we going to do about this? Are we doomed? Is vertebrate life on the surface of the Earth doomed? Is it going to become a world of bacteria? It already is, according to a lot of people. Well, before we look at that, I want to show you something that's brand new that comes from the last year. We wondered whether the same principles would apply to genera. Now, this tests a model of mine that's ancient, and says, okay, yes, area plays this role, and we have a mechanism for that. But I don't have any mechanisms for genera. I don't know how a genus is born. I was taught when I was a graduate student that a genus is born when a good taxonomist tells you. And I think that's true. I really do. You're going to find out in a second that there are a lot of good taxonomists today and in the past couple of centuries, a lot of them. Hang on. First, let's look at the data. Let's look at the results. Here we go. That's generic diversity as a function of actual evapotranspiration. Pretty impressive. All right, it's not 97.4%, it's only 97.2% for the R squared. Pretty impressive. And if we look at the temperature, it's also pretty impressive. It's dropped way down now. It's 96.4% for the R squared. The number of genera appears to follow the same pattern as the number of species. Why should that be? Well, let's take a little bit closer look at that and see if we're being fooled by those graphs. The answer is we're not. The number of genera does follow the number of species. Look at this. Hello? There we go. Regraphed, same data. Now we have the number of genera as a function of the number of species in a zoogeographical region. And the R squared here is 0.999 something. I can't remember. It's just lost in space. It's remarkable how good this thing is, this relationship is. And if you think about it, a couple of things become apparent. One of them is that it has a slope which is well below 1, which means that as you add species, you're adding species a whole lot faster than you're adding genera. And we've known that for a long time. Empirically, it's true that if you go to a place which is diverse at the specific level, then it's not quite as diverse at the generic level on a per species basis. There are more species packed into each genus, which suggests that we're going to lose genera when we lose species. And we're going to lose a lot of them. And that's why I did this. I wanted to see, because a lot of people say, oh, species, who cares about species? That's old. Well, I care about species. But it's a good question. What about higher taxonomic categories? And this is a first answer for vertebrates, land vertebrates. It really does work for them too, unfortunately. There isn't going to be a magic retention of generic diversity when we suffer mass extinction of the species. And so we kind of calculated the bye-bye using the coefficients that we got here. And you can, for technical reasons, this has to be done in 2 stages. The first stage is the stage of exotic species. So we bring in exotic species, we break down the barriers between these zoogeographical regions, and we bring on the Homogecene. Great. What does that do? Well, I point out to you that I published a paper about 12 years ago in which I said nothing. My answer was nothing. Okay. And what I point out to you is that was wrong. Okay? It was based on data at the time. The math is okay. And some of the points that are made in the paper are still things that I'll be willing to stand up and admit to. But nothing is wrong. It's taxon specific. It depends upon the relationship, the particular relationship between the large classes and area. And that's very different. Birds have what we would call a z-value in species area terms that is much lower than mammals. Birds are about 0.55, mammals are 1.0 something. So for mammals, loss of area doesn't do, loss of independence doesn't mean anything. And that was a good calculation for them. For amphibians, and this is strange, it is also very, very unimportant. how many zoogeographical regions there are. There's a loss, yes, but it's not terrible. But for birds and reptiles, it's a disaster. It's a disaster. And for, again, I say for technical and mathematical reasons, we had to calculate that first. And here are the results. You remember we start with 2,492 species. The new Pangea will house 13,309 at its new steady state, which is a loss of 47% of the species. And if that isn't a mass extinction, I don't know what it is. Meanwhile, the number of genera is not unaffected. It goes from 4,416 to 2,239, which means we're going to lose an even higher proportion of the genera. 49% will be gone. Not good. I think the good news that to get to this level of the Holocene, of the Homogene, will take a lot of effort on our part, and I don't see us being willing to extend it. I think there will be relics of these separate biogeographical regions, these separate zoological regions that will remain because we haven't been able to muster the effort and the money to bring that last frog over from Indonesia. So these are high estimates. They're the maximum kind of estimates. Now, the next step is to take that data that's produced by this model and generate the area loss. And I do that with some sample values. At 0%, we're still going to have 13,309 species and 2,239 genera. But lose 50% of the area of the regions, and we drop to 8,593. Lose 80%, we drop to 4,820. Lose 95%, and we drop to 2,010. We started at 24,992, and we wind up here in terms of the number of species at 2,010. That's over a 90% extinction rate for species. And the number of genera shows us the same pattern. If we don't stop taking area away from nature, if we don't begin to pay attention to the fact that we do not have to take area away from nature in order to do our business, to live our lives, to make our profits, if we don't start to realize that there's another way to put our foot on the ground, then those are the proportions of species and genera amongst the vertebrates that we're going to lose. I apologize for not doing fish, but I don't have any data for fish. You get me the data and I'll work on it. If you look at the combination, species loss with a 50% loss of area costs you 66% of the species, and 92% if you lose 95% of the area. Generic losses, 88%. And if you lose only half of the area, then it's still 64%. There is no case where there isn't a mass extinction here. There's absolutely no case. All right, fine. What do we do about it? Well, the traditional thing that we do about it is to try to reserve habitats, or even with restoration ecology, to try to restore patches of nature that we've abused. I don't think this should be abandoned. It can't be abandoned if we want success. But it's not enough. And here's why it's not enough. This cartoonist has actually captured exactly what's going on. There are species trying to survive in these small patches that we've preserved for them, and they're not too happy about it. And we've seen from the math that they shouldn't be too happy about it. We've seen from the data of the World Wildlife Fund that they shouldn't be too happy about it, but somehow I like the cartoonist's approach bit. Okay? What's going on here is that there are two threats when habitat is removed, and they're distinct. One of them is answered by the reservation ecology approach, and that one is Make sure no habitat disappears altogether. That attitude has saved a tremendous number of species to date by slowing extinction rates down. But it hasn't touched the quantitative problem. The quantitative problem is size matters. And even if you've got all the habitats represented in some remnant patches, you are going to lose species because the dynamics will be eroded. The solution is reconciliation ecology. Stop thinking that you can't do any good in places that you use, in places that you live. Stop thinking that in order to make a profit, you have to destroy. Stop thinking that in order to make a pretty neighborhood, you have to bring in all kinds of exotic species and plant them in your front yard. Start changing your attitude. Start thinking about coexisting with nature, but in a proactive sort of way, of redesigning the world that we use so that we reconcile it. We can live there, and they can live there. We can make a profit, and they can make a profit. We can enjoy it, and they can enjoy it. And the political nonsense that pits the green world against the green world of money, disappears. It's a false dichotomy. It disappears. What are the features of reconciliation ecology that we ought to be cognizant of? First, it doesn't insist on a return to any naturally occurring ecosystem. It works with what we have available to us, perhaps changes it a little bit, but it doesn't start looking for the way the world was when Columbus landed in the West Indies. Second, it re-engineers our ecosystems so that we're encouraging sharing of those ecosystems between people and native species. Third, it preserves human uses and benefits. Fourth, it respects human environmental preferences. That is absolutely crucial, as you'll see in just a second. And it works locally. It's like a new natural history, taking account of local conditions and local needs. If you want to be a successful reconciliation ecologist, you don't do what I do up to this point, which is wave your arms over the whole world and say this is what you have to do. You get down and dirty with some local area, you find out what the needs of the species are there, and you build the new ecosystem on the basis of what you find locally. You have a global impact and a global vision, but your work has to be local. And finally, and this is also extremely important, and as I talk to people about this, it is certainly not restricted to rare and endangered species. If you look at the old statements of the paleobiologists, there's one, trying to think whether it was George Gaylord Simpson or not, I think it may have been. Simpson said the Earth is a charnel house for species. It's pretty fancy English, but it means that they all die. And it's true. Look at the extinctions that have happened to some of the most incredibly abundant vertebrate species in this continent and others. Look at the passenger pigeon, which was at one time the single most populous bird in the world. 4 billion passenger pigeons. And they're gone. They're gone. And example after example shows us that high density of population or high amount of population does not protect a species. And so reconciliation ecology does not restrict itself to rare and endangered species. If you look at the results from the Audubon Society over the past 30 or 40 years, they too say these species, all of these species 40 years ago were incredibly common, and now we're having trouble finding them. What's happened? From my perspective, we are looking at a system property of a very complex system, and every single species is endangered. Just because the law says, that's not rare enough or whatever, we don't recognize it, doesn't mean that the law is right. Nature is right. And nature tells us, don't ignore common species. Now I'm going to show you, for the sake of enjoyment, a couple of examples of this where this has been done. This particular example you may know a little bit about. It's local, and I'm going to let the people around here describe it to you if they haven't already. But there have been an immense amount of projects done in this area for various kinds of animals, and they are freshwater to a large extent, and I don't know a whole lot about them. But I do know that some of them get very lucky, and the people around here manage to find ways to fit them with gas masks so that they can survive. The Yolo Basin is a real good example, thanks to the Sacramento Bee here for its photographs. And there's some fry, some salmon fry. And here's a picture of some of you guys driving these salmon out to the Yolo bypass where they're going to be given their liberty. And here's a picture of Emma Cox actually giving them their liberty. Is Emma in the room today? I don't know. I wanted to meet her. I got some pictures of a lot of you, but this one was the most graphic. And it's working. And what's happening too is that projects are showing how you can do this kind of work in rice paddies around here so that the farmer is growing rice very productively and also fish very productively. The salmon can be trapped, caught, whatever, and sold for a profit, and there's a lot more money to be made. A lot more money to be made. This took a lot of research to do, I know. And I'm cutting it real short too. Something that's just getting started, and I'm going to talk a lot about tomorrow, is from Tucson, and it has to do with the fact that we're trying to spread the populations of native plants throughout the city by getting not the government involved, but getting people involved, getting neighborhoods involved. I'm the director of Tumamoc, and Tumamoc has been studying botanical life histories and populations now on its hill since 1905. You do the math. I'm too tired. We've got the data, and we've got the species. There are over 300 species, and we have a set of people, growers, who are raring to go. These people have already figured out how to germinate and sell at a profit, 81 of our 300 and some species. So we decided to start in Tucson on this project, and we are facing a green citizenry. These are some people doing a very important bird count that we also sponsor. They are unpaid volunteers. We train them, yes. We have 100 formally organized neighborhoods. We can go to them as they choose individually and ignore the idiots who don't want to participate in this. And then eventually they'll get greedy, and we'll get to them too. It has robust NGOs already, and I won't mention any names here because I'm going to leave somebody out, and I don't want to do that. I love all of them. They are great, great people, and they're committed to ecological preservation, and they're working very beautifully in the community already. It also has local governments that really care about the environment. This is a little photograph of a ceremony that took place not too long ago that saved 32 years of botanical research on our hill. And we couldn't have done it without the participation, active participation of the politicians that you see there. In addition to the university president, who's just below the arrow pointer, the person in front of him is our city councilwoman, who is just a lioness. She's incredibly brave when it comes to Tumamoc Hill. I have seen her tell lawyers off in public. city lawyers that she's supposed to be cowed by. She is not, ever. And the next person was the supervisor of the county board of supervisors, the president, sorry, of the county board of supervisors when this picture was taken. And the next person is none other than Representative Raul Grijalva, who is our representative from this district and is very, very much behind Tumamoc. So we'll, and then comes me and some other irrelevant people. We've got people in the government who care about conservation, who are aware of the tremendous number of species that live in our valley and are committed to making sure that we do the very best to preserve them. And then finally, we have our hill, Tumamoc, which is the site of the world's oldest permanent ecology study plots, which was the place where restoration ecology was born and continues to thrive, and which has all kinds of outreach programs that I can't fund. But we'll get to it. We will get to it. So this seemed to be a good deal. So you guys are doing really well in this community, and we hope someday to be able to stand up and say, we are doing almost as well in our community. But our job is not to help the farms. Our job is to help the homeowners and the homeowner neighborhoods to reconcile a city. And tomorrow I'll talk about why cities are so important, so crucial to this whole effort. And I want to finish up with the best example of reconciliation ecology that I know. It's mature, it's been around working for 20 years, and it's an extraordinarily huge target. And it's a farm too. Farms are really, really, really important because they cover so much of the area of the earth. This is in southeastern Minnesota, which is a place where farmers since 1970 have been growing soy to feed cattle. That's what soy is for. And they've been doing immense amounts of ecological harm. Give you an idea, every year their farms look like that. There is no carbon storage. There is the potential for runoff of pesticides and fertilizer. There's the potential for soil loss. All of those potentials are realized. There is also a tremendous loss to the atmosphere of nitrous oxide, which is something like 200 or 300 times as powerful a pollutant in global warming as carbon dioxide itself. And most of it comes from farms like this. Yeah, you all know that the earth is in trouble and it has to do with carbon dioxide. So it would be really nice if we could store some of this stuff, if we didn't have to deal with soy, which is treated annually, but we could do woody agriculture. That was the idea here in Watershed Farm, which is a research farm operated in southeastern Minnesota, looking for a solution to this soy problem. Here's the United States graph that shows how we lose 68%. The nitrous oxide comes 68% from agricultural soil management. And they're not managing the soil, really, because they're losing the soil. And all the rest of it is relatively small potatoes. Can we get control of this? And the answer is yes. We get control of it by reading genetics books and doing some truly creative and clever selection experiments that within a small number of generations produce what is, for all intents and purposes, a brand new species of hazelnut. Hazelnuts grow on shrubs. You can see them growing right here, shrubs. They can be selected to have just the right size to be mechanically picked or shaken. They've gone to shaking now. They can be selected to mature as quickly as 1.5 years of age. They can be selected to do almost everything you like except to jump through a fiery hoop. They haven't figured that one out. And Phil Rutter, who is the genius involved here and the owner of Watershed Research Farm, shown standing there picking, has done some other things that I don't really have time to talk about that have presented us with it. He has saved the American chestnut, for example, with these same methods. The methods, however, I should talk about because they're general and they may be useful to you too in the future. He has a swarm of species in a genus, and they have various categories that he likes. Instead of working on each of them as individuals, which lowers the genetic variance through time, he brings them all together and interbreeds a swarm of them. That increases immensely the genetic variance of fitness. And as we learned from Fisher 80 years ago, up goes the ability to move quickly in natural selection. And that's what's going on, and that's what he does. And I've just seen some unbelievable quick things. But this is a new species of hazel. It's been bred from 2 native species. It is not genetic modification. It's not GME stuff like that. It's just plain interbreeding followed by selection. Okay. The yields are immense. And now they've figured out how to turn the dry kernels into BTUs. It's remarkable. I mean, you get from this about 4 times as much as you would get from an equivalent amounts of land planted in soy. It's unbelievable. And you might say, well, why isn't the United States doing something about paying the farmers to give up their old combines and buy whatever they need to grow this stuff? And the answer to that, of course, is a lobbying group, which I don't feel competent to talk about, but I've encountered. Okay? Look at this. This will show you. This is it, the thing being planted. The hazels now are known to live for 50 years or more. We have no reason to believe they'll die at 50, but that's the highest age he's been able to extrapolate right now. So this planting exercise, which is very, very laborious, it takes place every century or so. I think these people actually have drinking tea while they're at work. So we've got this mechanized for the planting, and we now have it also mechanized for the harvesting. Okay. This was the earlier method. This involves a hazel picker, which was a modified blueberry picker, and it sort of shakes the branches of the hazel without damaging what's living on them. It just shakes loose the nuts. Pretty soon you'll be able to look in the back of this and actually see the fingers of the hazel picker at work. There we go. And here's the hazel husker that was invented at the University of Nebraska. Everybody who's tried to hull this kind of nut knows it's no fun. I know some that are harder than this, like hickories. Don't ask me to crack open a hickory. But these turn out not to be too bad, and now they're automated and mechanized. And so all the pieces are in place. All the pieces are in place. And it turns out that, in the end, these plantations do not use pesticides because he's experimented and shown that the pesticides don't do anything except cost money. They do not release fertilizer, so there's no nitrous oxide. And there's no loss of fertilizer into the water of the streams around there. Why? Because they stay alive. They are not annual plants. They are alive all the time, and you can show that they're taking every molecule of fertilizer, and you don't need much. Taking every molecule of fertilizer out of the soil and putting it into the plant. For the same reason, there's no soil loss associated with them. So all the soil that's draining down the Mississippi River into the Gulf of Mexico wouldn't be draining down. There's no water pollution. They do not reduce the food supply. They increase the productivity by 3 or 4-fold. They triple yields, they quadruple yields. We can't be 100% sure, but it's something astounding like that. The oil that they produce not only can be fed to pigs, but you can burn it in your tractor. It's ready for diesel. And of course, they store carbon dioxide in their perennial tissues. It's a good deal. It's a good deal. So why am I talking about it? Because it turns out that although this was not intended, what Phil Rudder has done is to produce a new ecosystem that's a veritable zoo, with species present that have not been seen commonly for many, many, many years. I'll just show you some examples. What the heck? That's a Polyphemus larva, very colorful Saturniid moth. This is one of my favorites. Phil took these. And this is another one. This is a spider, jumping spider that mimics a hazelbud. And, you know, these things have to be eating something to survive and thrive. So all the food that spiders are eating are also common and diverse in this new plantation. And then finally, since we've been talking about vertebrates, I might as well show you that tree frog. The place is full of these tree frogs, as well as other kinds of vertebrates. The bobolinks that you see there and you don't see other places again and again. This is a successful project, and despite the lobbyists, it is spreading. There you see today where Phil has been able to train farmers in using these methods, and they are gradually being adapted. We don't know whether the Arizona experiment's going to be successful or the Nevada one. But in Nebraska, in Wisconsin, in Minnesota, and in Iowa, it's a roaring success already. Soy is about 50% of the agricultural landscape of the upper Midwest. We're not talking about small potatoes here. We're talking about a major revolution that will produce habitat for wild things, profits for farmers, and ecological sanity for the country. And that's where I think we're going. And that's where I hope you go, too. The general strategy is pretty clear. Conservation in our time has to learn how to make the future feel a lot like the past. Thanks.
We do have time for a couple of questions.
So, Mike, thank you very much for this. It's exciting to hear you talk after Peter, I work with Peter, and he introduced us to your work, and we tried to kind of apply that to thinking about aquatic ecosystems. And
you guys are awesome, by the way. I've got to tell you that. You really are.
And there's something extremely hopeful in what in your message, but at the same time, the math that you started with, I kind of come back to that, and I'm an economist by training, I apologize. But there's still
some of my best friends are economists.
That's what these guys say. But there's still some inevitability of some extinctions that are going to happen. And I see sort of on the path toward, whether it's 100 or 1,000 years, as you say, sort of looking forward, some major difficulties in figuring out how we adapt the laws that we have now to protect species in ways that can be flexible to accommodate these pragmatic strategies. And so I just would love your
That's not a question, that's an answer.
Okay.
You're so right. You are so right. I've seen this, and I've seen other people encounter these things. And with what we've got in many cases is we've got statutes that were well meant for a different time. and they no longer protect us. What they do now is they get in our way. And there's nothing I can say about that except that it's true. I will say this, being more rosy, we have a lot of time, I think. This is not like global warming. This is not going to happen in the next 10, 15 years. We don't know how long it's going to take. I know of one estimate of extinction rate that's worth its salt. It was done by Stuart Pym and a friend of his named Oyugi in Africa. And it's for a tiny little area, and it's island biogeography. All of the other estimates of extinction, as far as I've seen, just don't hold water. There's no foundation for them in math. There's extrapolation, there's guesswork. They just don't know. We don't know whether we're going to lose, excuse me, I'm going to get something from my throat because otherwise, we don't know whether we're going to lose 2% of the species in the next century or 80%. It's that serious. We really don't know about the rate. That's it. But heck, I don't get paid to be a pessimist.
Other comments, questions?
Over here?
Hey, yeah. I wasn't sure. So you keep referring to tomorrow. Are you going to be here tomorrow? Lecturing more?
Am I going to be here tomorrow?
Yeah,
So tomorrow he'll give a second talk in room, I got it right on the board, 1001 King Hall.
At 10?
At 10 a.m. And his focus there is going to be on Tucson.
I'm going to speak especially about the project that we're doing. We've got some new software we're trying to develop that may prove useful to everybody else too. The developers are trying to make it exportable to any situation that wants to do reconciliation ecology. Yeah, I don't know. We're trying our best. We've got some crazy hypotheses that are almost certainly wrong. But if we can start testing the crazy hypotheses, then maybe somebody will come up with some good ones that we can also test. So I'll be talking mostly about that tomorrow and a few other things. But I'm going to try to avoid repeating what I said today.
Well, that's probably a good way to leave it. If we wanted to get the students.
Yeah, so we have, you don't know it yet, but there's two groups of you here. There's students here that are enrolled or will soon be enrolled in the graduate seminar part of this presentation series. And we're going to go to dinner with the speaker. So stick around if you're part of that group or you want to enter one of those classes. We have 3 of these classes. I don't know who or how many are enrolled. Peter knows for the ecologists, but I'm not quite sure for the engineers. And I don't. Anybody lawyers? Any lawyers here? So we have a couple people maybe from Rick Frank's group that will come along. So we'll run out of the fly. Well, thank you.